Today, occupying a halfway house between formal presentation and experimental making, I aim to demonstrate the integration of feminist theory into arts practice, activated by the strict COVID lockdowns in 2020. Entitled Splice of Life, Home Laptop Wi-Fi, it aims to introduce the viewer to some of the creative and conceptual methods that have taken place in this work as an expression of the transitional whilst enabling screenshots of life lived between the screen to emerge. So for those of us who are forced off-site to work on-site at home, the acceleration and enmeshment of home life, work life, entangled with family life, childcare and professional duties, and in my case PhD research, provided its challenges. So for practice-based research, this imposed new and shifting propositions, whilst conversely living in a bubble. So here, distance and proximity between professional, domestic, homework, housework, lecturing, lounging, academic work and entertainment could be treated as the raw material in which to work co-productively. So I begin with this blurred snapshot of the kitchen table, since it functioned as a place of convergence between domestic and professional duties. The space in which the family always meets for meals, but where my laptop, books and the post and daily clutter seem to reside. So things and thoughts, as Gilles Deleuze states, might advance or grow out from the middle, because that's where everything unfolds. So this is important to reflect on, to make connections from this point of contact and to also work in these gaps. Here it was possible to make artwork out of the recorded archival material of past events during the lockdown and to explore recurrent themes of domestic professional occupation. I suggest, when disseminated for arts practice, that these experiences can be articulated as some of the pieces and patches of lived experience, providing fleeting and lasting artefacts, life as splices, providing screen-based expressions or evocations of daily life. So in 1986, feminist art critic Lucy Lippard suggested, the mixing and matching of fragments is the product of an interrupted life. What is popularly seen as repetitive, obsessive and compulsive in women's art is in fact a necessity for those whose time comes in small squares. So this concept is an essential aspect of my assemblage, seeming as relevant now as it did then as an integration of feminist theory into arts practice, and as a strategy to employ. So here it enabled ways to assemble recorded material, still images and sound files as the beginnings of a working patchwork, which involves collecting and conjoining visual materials into a unified whole. So here I use two slices or splices of recordings. The first on the left is this Sound of Swan Lake by Russian composer Tchaikovsky, from 1875, played from this musical box which has spent the last few years living on a shelf in the kitchen. The recording on the right is of a digital doodle. It uses the site of the kitchen table as an image lifted from the previous film, which is then worked upon at the site of the kitchen table, hereby perpetuating that cycle to work from the spaces in their different guises. And I'm also subconsciously humming Swan Lake. So during the pandemic, the practice advocated a make do and mend mentality, working with what was to hand, and as a result involved tinkering with the available digital technologies. So contextually, it also enabled matters of the home to be distributed in the midst of interruptions, whilst providing ways of stitching the discourse together. So this paradoxically also reveals spaces of tension, bursting at seams, falling apart, partly for the production of the visual aesthetic or soundscape. So with much and more time spent in virtual meeting spaces, this provided a site for contextualisation using and including myself as available material, as bricolage, which became both central and peripheral to this analysis, enabling pieces and patches of lived experience during the pandemic to emerge and sometimes to remain in the screen. So bricolage, described as the piecing and patching of disparate things to create something anew, was also applied as conceptual and technical mediations between analogue, digital and virtual space, so that working with what was to hand, tinkering between laptop, smartphone and Teams Zoom social space, could become a playful yet deviant activity in the midst of everyday occupations, whilst partly displaying participants in the screen. So, between virtual professional teams time and creative domestic playtime, liminal space of virtual, digital, professional domestic moments lived in and out of the screen involved a series of reactions but also transactions and transitions between home laptop Wi-Fi as post-production tinkering, now post-pandemic method, combining aspects of bricolage and montage as ways to juxtapose the personal with the political, art with minor politics. So one such implication of this has involved cutting pieces of recordings, as you are seeing here, from Microsoft Teams meetings, then looking up closely at this material. So in this short 3-minute cut, it is possible to observe the distance and proximity between virtual households. So seen here, myself and another participant appear side by side, where windows at the bottom of the team space were available. So we could in fact geographically be only a few metres apart, or indeed thousands of miles away from each other, which accentuates this lockdown or locked-in condition, feeling both restricting but also liberating in terms of connection with others. So I want to work with this raw material to reproduce these screenshots as a feminist inquiry, and this should enable my matrixial method to be more fully integrated alongside collage and montage, which seem essential given the history and wealth of feminist art production. So in this practice, it provides a process that could be reproduced in a lo-fi and digital way, which seems appropriate as a contemporary reworking of these methods. So the pandemic perversely enabled me to extend my previous disciplinary boundaries. Pre-pandemic, these were located in textile theory and practice, because of the lack of access and time available to dedicate myself to these methods. But as a consequence, the limitations, restrictions and expectations imposed by the pandemic. So for example, as an academic, we were expected to teach art design practice online through Teams rather than in person in studio spaces. And this forced me to handle new and different digital virtual materials. I emphasise awkwardly, but in a pedagogical and praxis turn, it produced alternative and emerging methods. So conceptually, textile here provided the interface between a whole host of working practices or occupations, so that workwomanship, as I prefer to refer to it, in the home could be addressed in the intersections between live and recorded events, still and moving image, sound and silence, effect and affect, textile and digital, domestic and virtual, architecture, space. So workwomanship in the home could be witnessed partly through Zoom's two meeting space as visual vestiges. So the resulting work is a methodological approach which continues to be developed through the practice based research, and which is reliant on the historical and contemporary contextual references to weave the interdisciplinary aspects together. So these span across the fields of art house cinema, feminist montage, matrixial theory, philosophy and psychoanalysis. But I want to take a moment to focus on a few of these further examples to demonstrate their significance to the practice, and to then establish how this leads to a further understanding of Bracker L. Ettinger's matrixial. So to begin with, here we see Jean as part of a 3-hour-long film which unfolds through secretions of time, slowly released durationally over moments, hours, days. So the repetitive and daily ritual of Jean, wife, widow and mother to one son, is brought into focus as she attends to inconsequential moments that collectively make up her everyday. So each facet of time is encapsulated in a handling of sorts of procedural activity, publicly displaying a distant intimacy, as film theorist Brenda Longfellow posits. So grabbing frames from the film, my aim has been to integrate Jean's domestic space, seen here on the right of the image, with that of my own, so that we are conjoined in our shared separate duty. I think this is important to acknowledge, since women's work in the home has largely been overlooked, and during the pandemic it became even more enmeshed with daily life, as the home presented multiple occupations within the same household at one time. It therefore seemed essential to give value to this aspect of daily life as part of the discourse around feminist arts practice. And so critically, the appearance of an ordered, organised assemblage of domestic duty, in Jean's case, which is really kind of apparent for most of the duration of the film, differed greatly to what at times felt like chaos and cacophony in this or my domestic space. So, as a direct response to a first viewing of Jean Dillman, watched in the early lockdown stages in March 2020, I produced a piece of work entitled Fuzzy Film 12.59, which represents both the duration of the recording as well as relating to a particular part of the day, lunchtime, a break. It is essentially a semi-static blue-green palette vibrating on the computer screen with a collection of unfiltered domestic house sounds evident in the background, combined to create a visually digital aesthetic experience. It operates as an experimental splice of this ongoing praxis. So a later and shorter version of Fuzzy Film 12.59 is nestled into a 12-minute Zoom time slot, and this demonstrates the need to get things done quicker and in the gaps between other activities, which in turn simulates part of the mechanic and machinic processing of the arts practice, but also the occupation of housework. So I want to elucidate a patchworking mentality or methodology for the practice, which I hope I've started to kind of allude to. So in this, I place selected digital film clips side by side, top, middle and bottom on the desktop screen in a unified arrangement as a visual analogy for domestic digital sampling. So the video files are then selected at random, such a cacophony of sounds are also produced. So this involved haptic engagement with the keypad as one layer of tacticity, combined with that of audio interference. So files and fabrics share a common process of trimming to remove excess and can also be stitched together. So here, tinkering imaginatively with the ready-to-hand technologies alongside contextual analysis provides a way to intervene with the daily grind of homework, housework, professional domestic work as performative process in practice. So, reflecting on Joanna Davis's 1979 film, Often During the Day, I fold the film into the contextual references, since it also provides another glimpse into the gendered politics of housework, elucidating the political intention or its political intention, and drawing attention to gestural domestic resonances, using, to quote from Patty Gale Holmes, detailed close-ups of a shared kitchen to examine culturally prescribed domestic roles. The film integrates still images, photography with filmed footage as a record of minor events taking place in a kitchen. And it does this in such a way as to provide hand-tinted photographic elements and as such elevating the status of seemingly mundane objects. So, for example, a tea strainer, bread on the morning breakfast table, or a cat's bowl, which are given focused attention. So further to this, domestic sound combined with a musical soundtrack provides a cohesive yet uncomfortable perspective or perception, perhaps on an underlying patriarchy. And so like Jean Dillman, this short film provides a visual document of domestic life through film. And as a reworking here of Joanne Davis's Often During the Day, I have combined an even shorter excerpt of the film made, available by Four Corners Feminist Film online, so that it enmeshes domestic sounds in one space with that in another, my household.
Sometimes twice a day I wipe the floor around the cat saucers.
So I have alluded to the significance of Brackett L. Ettinger's work in this practice, and so this requires a little bit further contemplation. So a psychoanalyst and painter, she has been influential to me in relation to her complex theory of the matrixial, and I draw on her vocabulary and its potential application in and through practice to provide a contemporary representation of home as a co-emerging space, to adopt one of her terminologies. So here, matrixial might offer an alternative space of encounter and enables co-productivity between occupations through and between the screen as physical, digital and virtual lenses. So this I will demonstrate through practice can be assembled in these in-between spaces as the intersections, for example, of time, duration, space and place. So matrixial provides a way to combine facets between bricolage, domestic, textile and the feminine through women's work, adopting recurrent computational post-production methods such as cutting, splitting, duplication and looping as ways to enable the materials to be reproduced time and time again, but in multiple arrangements. So here in this experiment, using myself as material again, by duplicating similar parts cut from a larger Microsoft Teams call, it is possible to reassemble fleeting moments time and again as a way to embody a mixing space, duplicated visually and auditorily. I play with the idea of a matrixial mixing space, whereby aspects of interruption, disruption, alteration, iteration and utterance co-emerge experimentally for the practice as an effective gestural response. I'm attempting to explore here vital elements of everyday life, working in the gaps, delays, repetitions of everyday domestic professional life. So as I tinker with ideas, the opportunity to select multiple images and overlay one on top of another presents itself, obscuring the one below, but revealing it by parts of its rotated edges, as is being demonstrated here. So this very simple expression, available as part of the digital software interface, is capable of also producing endless and infinite arrangements from the files available on my computer. So this method produces its own type of digital patchwork, a process which could later be re-explored through textile making. I mention this though now because it also seems a convenient expression of, or another convenient expression of matrixial space, a maelstrom of activities reproduced day after day in numerous ways. So this again combines different durational moments when they are rehashed as a digital audio domestic artefact, as opposed to this still static image that I've chosen to show here. So the photographic image rather than the digital movie file. So in conclusion, I've aimed to demonstrate just some, or give some kind of tasters or indications of how domestic professional life can provide these fleeting and lasting artefacts as digital experiments, life lived during the pandemic, which mostly forced myself as practitioner into peripheral spaces within my own practice, whilst working between and across digital, virtual and physical spaces. So it is intended to be an experimental way of philosophising about this point in time, which each household experienced at some level. So a feminist inquiry seemed pertinent here, which has been touched upon, but deserves much further examination.